One of my all-time favorite speakers at Curt, and one of the most intelligent young men I know on the economy and on all things concerning monetary policy. Anirban Basu has been here many, many times before. He is the chairman and CEO of Sage Policy Group, and he has a long history, he and his organization, of providing economic insight to our industry with a depth and also a humor that makes potentially upsetting information a little easier to hear. Monetary masala, and somebody looked up masala and told me that masala was a mix of Indian spices. More on that right now. Let's welcome my friend Anirban Basu to the stage. Thank you for coming out. Good to see you.
Good morning. An opportunity now to talk about the economy, where we are in the business cycle. Obviously, much to talk about. I will leave some time at the end of this for your questions, so please think about what you'd like to ask as I go through the material. As had been noted during that very kind introduction, my presentation today is entitled Monetary Masala. It's a play on a 1991 film called Mississippi Masala. That movie starred two actors that you see on the screen there, one with whom you're very familiar, Denzel Washington, the other with whom you might be less familiar, the Indian-British actress Srita Chowdhury. This was her debut in 1991. I have followed her career very closely since that time, as it turns out. I, in fact, met her at JFK Airport. We happened to be on the same flight from New York to New Delhi, and I actually approached her. I started talking to her, and my very strong belief is, had I another 15 seconds, I could have changed both of our lives. But it didn't work out, and so I have chosen to have Denzel Washington serve as the unifying theme of this presentation. You'll see that throughout the presentation. And let's get into the data, and let's talk about the most salient aspect of economic life in recent years, which has been that excess inflation rate. That is really, I think, what has differentiated this period, this moment in economic history, as much as anything else macroeconomically. This is a play on a 2009 film called The Taking of Pelham 123, in which Denzel Washington starred as a train dispatcher. But right to the data, two measures of inflation here. The line at the top there in green is inflation as measured by the core CPI, the core consumer price index. That's one of America's favorite measures of inflation, of course, very popularly discussed in the media. And then the blue line under that represents inflation as measured by the favorite measure of the Federal Reserve, which is the core PCE deflator, the core personal consumption expenditures deflator. You'll notice that inflation has fallen over time, of course, but nowhere close to the 2% target maintained by the Federal Reserve. So if you look at the green line there over the last 12 months, which we have data, and we'll get data on consumer prices tomorrow as it turns out, but inflation running at 3.2% by that measure. And if you notice the end of the series, much of the data I'll share with you this morning are time series data, you'll notice that we're not getting any closer to 2%. If you look at the core PC deflator, again, the line in blue, 2.8% year over year. But again, you don't see much progress in terms of getting down to 2%. Now, we economists love to talk about inflation in the context of interest rates and Federal Reserve policy making, but there are broader implications here. Many small business operators will tell you that their number one challenge right now is inflation. Many households will say something very similar to that. This burst of inflation shows up in early 2021, and the effect of these price increases is cumulative. I don't know if you had eggs at breakfast. I hope you did, because you may not see them for many months to come. I mean, the things are scarce. So let me take you back in time. Let me take you back to May of 2020. Why that month is the baseline. That is the first month of this economic expansion. America loses 22 million jobs in March and April of 2020. We start to add back jobs in May of 2020, and according to the National Bureau of Economic Research's Business Cycle Dating Committee, the recession officially ended in April of 2020. So if you start with May of 2020 and look at what price levels were back then as measured by the Consumer Price Index and compare those prices to December of 2024 prices, so around a 4.5-year comparison, how much did prices increase during that period based on the Consumer Price Index? Well, the headline numbers are down below. Overall inflation in a country that aspires to 2% inflation per annum, running at 23%. Strip out food and energy prices, you get that so-called core rate inflation, all items less food and energy, 21%. Categorically in green, transportation services prices up nearly 48%. That's your shipping costs in 4.5 years. There's a neat correspondence between wage pressures and price pressures. Those things move in tandem. So one of the things that we observed is massive increases in compensation for all kinds of workers, including drivers. Of course, the last few years have been associated with a fair amount of labor strife in America. So we've had strikes among actors and writers. We've had strikes among Boeing machinists. In October, it was the International Longshoremen's Association for 3 days. Some negotiations have not ended in strikes. Negotiations between United Parcel Service and the Teamsters Union. Those negotiations transpired in 2023 and produced a 5-year agreement. And during the 5th year of that agreement, the average full-time UPS truck driver will be earning $170,000 per year. That's $170K. That's wages plus benefits. But it's $170K, forcing people like myself to ask the question, how do I look in brown? And based on the app Spectacular. But the point is, that's inflationary. I'm not saying it's not good, but it is inflationary. Energy prices are nearly 47%. Shelter costs, that includes things like apartment rents, 25%. We'll talk about the multifamily market later in the presentation. And then food prices up 24%. And that's what really has many Americans exercised. It's that grocery bill. Oh, they complain about electricity bills, auto insurance, all kinds of things. But it's that grocery bill they talk most about. I talk to a lot of Americans about the economy, in actual conversations. Whether it's at breakfast before presentations like this one, or in Ubers and Lyfts especially. I take a lot of Ubers and Lyfts. I'll take a Lyft after this presentation, go to the airport for my presentation tomorrow in Fort Lauderdale, and that's typical. And many of you take Ubers and Lyfts. And those of you that do know that as a passenger you rate the driver, you may be less worth the driver rates you as a passenger. And I've very recently become privy to my passenger ratings, and they're extremely low. And you might say, well, that makes sense. We've seen you speak before on Iban. I think this is beyond my personality, that there's something else afoot, because I take every Uber or Lyft trip as an opportunity to interview an American. And I'll ask them questions like, and of course I'm doing this from the back seat, I'll ask them questions like, hey, how much do you really make doing this on an hourly basis once you factor in depreciation, insurance, and gasoline? What's your highest level of educational attainment? What other options did you have? Did you have any? Do you view this as a career? What does your family think? Why would you choose this vehicle in particular? And apparently these questions are off-putting. But when you ask people about the economy, they'll say, this is what has me upset. Many people in Washington are surprised by this. Why are people upset with the economy? Got a 4.0% rate of unemployment, ongoing job growth, rapid wage growth, record home prices, et cetera, record stock market. S&P is above 6,000 as we woke up this morning. What are people so upset about right here? They can't keep up. And now it is conceivable that price pressures actually grow going forward because, of course, we have a new president, inaugurated January 20th. And there have been some policy proposals put forward that could actually bolster price pressures. So I call it the Manhattan Candidate, based on a 2004 film called The Manchurian Candidate, again starring Denzel Washington. But some of these, and by the way, I'm not making any commentary about the wisdom behind any of these policies. That's not my role here, that's not my place. I'm simply speaking macroeconomically, the effect of this might be inflationary, because extending the expiring 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, to the extent that that puts more money back into the economy than otherwise would be the case, that would tend to be inflationary. Additional reduction in the corporate tax rate to 15%. Not saying that's a bad idea. As you know, the federal corporate tax rate right now is 21%. If you add in state level corporate taxation, the average across America is around 26%. But to the extent that that pushes more money into the economy, that's inflationary. Eliminate income taxes on Social Security benefits. Eliminate taxes on tips. 10 to 25% across the board tariff on imports. And now we have arguably our first targeted tariff of the Trump administration, which of course those 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum. We'll see if those are implemented and so on and so forth, and to what extent. You might remember in 2018, something similar happened. Introduction of new tariffs on steel and aluminum, 25% for steel, 10% for aluminum. And the immediate effect back in 2018 was to raise steel and aluminum prices. No surprise, that's probably what's going to happen this time around. And then mass deportation of undocumented migrants, of all undocumented migrants. That's not going to happen. It costs about $10,500 to deport one migrant. But the point is, to the extent that that impacts the labor market, including construction, by the way, because construction is one of these segments that makes particular use of the services of undocumented migrants, immigrants generally, but undocumented migrants in particular. Agriculture is another one, speaking of food prices, those kinds of things. And so, again, it's not my place to suggest that this is good policymaking or bad policymaking. I will say that if I was a presidential advisor, and I'm not, but if I were, I might say to Mr. Trump, with all due respect, Mr. President, perhaps you shouldn't do too much. Keystone Pipeline, I get it, high-profile deportations, fine. But what I mean is this, all you really need to do, sir, is to allow the US economy to re-equilibrate post-pandemic, to allow inflation to subside back to that 2% level, to allow the Federal Reserve to slash interest rates, to unleash a bevy of economic activity, auto purchases, home purchases, housing production, et cetera, appliance purchases, you name it. You just sit back and you take credit for it. But that's, of course, not been the approach, at least as far as I can tell. And so that has implications for all kinds of things, including, of course, interest rates. This is the principal mechanism by which the Federal Reserve influences economic growth and its byproduct inflation, the federal funds rate, also known as the Fed funds rate, also known as the overnight bank lending rate. This is the rate at which banks can borrow from one another overnight. And why would a bank do that? Because banks require a certain amount of reserves inside the bank to make loans outside of themselves, and occasionally banks run up against that constraint. When this rate is set at a low level, banks are more likely to borrow from one another, thereby shoring up their reserves, thereby lending more aggressively in the economy. When this rate is set at a higher level, an opposing behavior ensues. Now, again, that burst of inflation shows up in early 2021. The Federal Reserve sees that in the data. We all do. They look at the same data that we do. They might pay more attention to the PCE than the CPI. That's true, but they see the same data. But they view that inflation, as everyone knows, as transitory, almost purely supply chain driven. That as supply chains normalize post-pandemic, inflation just naturally abate to that 2% level we'd enjoyed for many years prior to the pandemic. Indeed, for many years prior to the pandemic, the Federal Reserve had a tough time getting inflation up to 2%. That was the challenge. Post-global financial crisis, it was often stuck at around 1.75%. Instead, the Federal Reserve presides over the creation of that wage price spiral. After about a year of this, the Federal Reserve starts to push back more aggressively. March 17th of 2022, they start raising rates, but even then they only dip their toes in inflation-fighting waters, raising rates that day 0.25 percentage points. But next meeting, they get more serious, 0.5 percentage points. Next 4 meetings consecutively, 0.75 percentage points each meeting, then back to 0.5 percentage points, then 0.25, then 0.25 May 3rd of 2023, 0.25 percentage points, pause in June of 2023, July 26th of 2023, a 0.25% rate increase, and then 8 meetings during which they pause. These are the 8 meetings right here. They pause, they do nothing for 8 meetings, and then starting late last year, September 18th, they start to cut rates. You'll remember that day they cut rates by 0.5 percentage point. Markets were very, very excited by that. 2 days after the election, November 7th, they cut rates again by a 0.25 point. December 18th, another 0.25 point. So what I'm graphing through here is the upper limit on the federal funds rate, which had peaked out during the cycle at 5.5%, is now 4.5%. But my point is very simple. Interest rates are still high. Monetary accommodation is not there. Interest rates are restrictive to growth. But during this entire period of these high interest rates, the federal government has been increasing its outlays. So, this morning at breakfast, we talked about the fact that during the first 4 months of the federal fiscal year, the federal budget deficit was $838 billion, about 15% greater than it was the same time a year ago. So the federal government is, but now, of course, fiscal policy is becoming increasingly restrictive. So monetary policy, fiscal policy now both moving in the opposite direction in terms of pro-growth. That can be offset, of course, by private investment, but this can create some issues for the macroeconomy going forward. Now, admittedly, to this point, the economy's performed brilliantly. And I have to admit to you, economic performance of the past 2 years in America has been far greater than I would have expected. Last 2 years, let's look at the GDP data, for instance. This is the broadest indication of U.S. economic progress. Growth in our nation's output as measured by GDP. So the last quarter for which we have data is the fourth quarter of 2024, a quarter during which the U.S. economy expanded 2.3% on an annualized basis. For 2024, the U.S. economy grows 2.8% after growing 2.5% in 2023. I did not expect that kind of performance, not with interest rates so high. I'll talk about what surprised me in just a moment, but I was surprised. Now, the Federal Reserve maintains a product known as GDP Now that estimates current quarter gross domestic product. We're now, of course, neatly ensconced in the first quarter of 2025, and that model suggests that the U.S. economy is on pace to grow 2.9% on an annualized basis during the current quarter. None of these are indicia of recession or even any kind of meaningful economic slowing. And at the heart of that growth story has been the fighting force known as the American consumer, who continue to be on a spending tear. This is monthly retail sales. Maybe we had a record Black Friday, a record Cyber Monday. We just got the December retail sales and they were fabulous. Oh, you hear stories. You hear stories from companies like Starbucks, for instance. And Starbucks has had a few rough quarters. And they'll tell you that their occasional customers disappeared. The folks who were showing up for the first time after the pandemic to buy $5 iced vanilla lattes, whatever it happened to be, they've disappeared. And we'll talk about why they have later on in the presentation. In fact, the folks at Starbucks just changed their CEO. The previous CEO was a guy named Lakshman Narasimhan, who looks just like me. The new CEO is a guy named Brian Nickel, came from Chipotle, looks nothing like me. But the point is, you hear stories, but by and large, it's consumer spending. And by the way, much of the growth of consumer outlays recently has not been on retailed items here depicted, but rather on services. The Americans continue to set occasional records for the number of people passing through TSA checkpoints on a single day. They're going to see Beyonce and Taylor Swift in concert, all those kinds of things. In August of 2023, the average Taylor Swift concert ticket purchased on resale, and that's why people buy them on resale, sold for $1,619 per ticket. And she sells at football stadiums routinely in this country, often multiple times, same city, same week. She's just for Australia. The Australian government thanked her for improving their economy. She generated about $300 million of economic impact in 4 days. She's not merely a musical phenomenon, she's an economic one. And I would repeat what I've said before, this thing between her and Travis Kelce is fabulous. It's exactly what America needs during these tumultuous times. It is not at all annoying. So anyway, now, I will make the case later on in the presentation that the consumer cannot continue to spend this way, but not now, because here's another thing that surprised me. America got massively wealthier during this period of high interest rates. This is total U.S. household wealth. In 1980, total U.S. household wealth was around $20 trillion. It's now around $160 trillion. America is a phenomenally wealthy nation. And there's lots of talk, of course, in recent years about American exceptionalism. And no one creates companies like Google and Meta and NVIDIA and so on and so forth. There's a reason America has become so wealthy. Now, of course, the wealth is not evenly divided across society. It's a nation known for having some significant wealth disparities. Now, again, these data come from the Federal Reserve, as do these. Here I'm breaking out American wealth by percentile. I'm simply stacking the most affluent households in America down through the least affluent and asking the question, where does the wealth reside in America? So if you look at that teal-colored slice at the top of the slide, that's the wealth controlled by the top 0.1% of Americans. There are about 340,000 of them. And that top 0.1% of Americans controls 13.8% of the nation's wealth. If you look at the green segment below that, that's wealth controlled by the balance of the top 1%. So that's your 99th percentile to your 99.9th percentile. They control another 17% of the nation's wealth, which means that the top 1% controls a bit less than 31% of the nation's wealth. The yellow segment below that is the wealth controlled by the balance of the top 10%. So that's your 90th percentile to your 99th percentile. They control another 36.5% of the nation's wealth, which means that the top 10% controls almost precisely 2/3 of the nation's wealth. The brown segment below that, or orangey segment, is the wealth controlled by the 50th percentile to the 90th percentile. So that's 40% of America's population, and they control another 30.3% of the nation's wealth, which means that the bottom 50% of Americans controls 2.4% of the nation's wealth. So top 50%, 97.6% of the nation's wealth, bottom 50%, 2.4% of the nation's wealth. It's two nations economically, or at least in terms of wealth profile. Now, some of those folks in the bottom 50% are homeowners. The US home ownership rate is meaningfully above 60%, and so the equity in their homes counts in these data. But they don't have much financial wealth. They don't have major portfolios or anything like that. They don't have a portfolio. They live from paycheck to paycheck. So what do you need in a country with such stark wealth disparity, such inequality? What do you need? Well, it's obvious, isn't it? You need an equalizer. This is, of course, Denzel Washington as Robert McCall. Such a good movie, they made it thrice. But and what has been the great equalizer here? It's been that labor market, that very strong job market, in which in many cases one could make the case that human capital has gained the upper hand over management, at least in negotiating, at least in recent years. And presumably we'll have more job creation and more labor market strength going forward based on this statistic. This from the JOLTS, the Job Openings and Labor Turnover Survey, measures the number of available unfilled jobs in America. In December, which is the last month for which we have data, America home to 7.6 million available unfilled job openings. You might say, well, Anirban, I noticed the number of job openings has been falling over time, and it actually fell in December itself. That's true. Labor market is normalizing post-pandemic, and I would say to you that some segments of the economy that are interest rate sensitive, particularly interest rate sensitive, are starting to feel the effects of that, show the effects of that, but we'll talk more about that during another part of the presentation. But it is still the case that America is home to more job openings now, 7.6 million, than it was pre-pandemic, when the economy was considered to be very, very strong. Back then, we had a 3.5% rate of unemployment, a 50-year low. We had about 7 million available unfilled jobs, now 7.6 million. And it's still the case that we have more job openings than unemployed people. And so labor market is still fairly strong, quite strong. Now, if you look at construction, which of course is a particularly interest rate sensitive segment of the economy, the picture isn't quite as impressive. This is US construction job openings over time, back to 2015. And if you look at the most recent data, you see a real fall off in construction job openings. So coming into last year, early last year, we had about 450,000 available unfilled construction job openings. The reading for December was 217,000, a real fall off. Now, again, this is back to 2015, so if you take a longer term perspective on this, say, okay, from a long-term perspective, it doesn't look as bad. It just, relative to the last year, over the past year, it's really plummeted, this statistic, but we still have, by historic standards, a fair number of construction job openings, and it is still the case that many contractors tell me their number one challenge continues to be finding people to do the work. One of the things I do is I'm the chief economist at CFMA, the Construction Financial Management Association. We conduct a survey every month called the Confindex, or every quarter called the Confindex, and the number one challenge facing contractors, according to those construction financial professionals, continues to be recruiting skilled workers and retaining them. So in any case, now, again, overall, economy-wide, there are a significant number of available unfilled jobs, and so when a nation enters every month with plentiful numbers of job openings, it's quite likely that that ensuing month, the nation will end up adding jobs, which is exactly what America has done since December of 2020. Last month, America lost jobs, which December of 2020 is that negative bar at the very left of the slide. So through elections, hurricanes, wildfires, bridge collapses, you name it, America's managed to add jobs every month since December of 2020. We just got in the jobs report for January. We knew it was going to be messy. The wildfires in California, of course, and also that polar vortex, which impacted certain parts of the country. And so we knew it was going to be not a particularly clean number. And the number came in at 143,000, perfectly respectable. Unemployment fell actually in January to 4.0%. So 4.0% is the national rate of unemployment. All of those data or statistics, I think, are a indicia of a labor market that still remains quite strong. This is U.S. jobs recovered since February of 2020. Why am I using February of 2020 as a baseline? That's the last month before we shut down the US economy. So if you start with February of 2020, you're actually capturing that period of job loss in March and April of 2020. So how many jobs have we added since February of 2020? Isn't that 6.6 million? But what I really want to point out here is that fifth bar from the top, that fifth horizontal bar, construction. Contractors have been hiring like mad, which is really quite remarkable. And I want you to keep that in mind when we talk about statistics later on in the presentation. But contractors have been really staffing up very, very aggressively. Now, what does the construction labor market look like if there's more pressure not to use foreign-born talent? Set aside whether or not they're documented or undocumented, but foreign-born talent. It would seem to me that a construction job market that arguably has been weakening over the past year all of a sudden gets pretty tight once again. So we'll see what that looks like. We'll speculate on that as we go through the presentation. We are now living in an environment in which, though inflation is above the Federal Reserve's 2% target, wage growth exceeds inflation, which means that consumers are seeing real growth in spending or buying power. So too much going on in this slide, admittedly. I'm juxtaposing two data series here, measures of inflation as it turns out, year-over-year percentage change. The inflation measure is the blue. Inflation measure is the blue line. That's, again, inflation is measured by the Consumer Price Index, but that's overall Consumer Price Index. Not just the core CPI, but the overall all-in food, energy, et cetera, everything in. It says that inflation between January of 2024 and December of 2024, December of 2023 and December of 2024 running at 2.9%. The green line is average hourly earnings, growth in average hourly earnings. And what that says is that over the last 12 months worth of data, which is through January of 2025, that's 4.1%. So that cross occurred. You see where the blue line and the green line crossed toward the right of the slide there? That occurred in May of 2023. Since May of 2023, average hourly earnings growth has exceeded inflation, which again is one of the reasons we're in this virtuous cycle in which consumers are spending, impacted employers are hiring, which fuels further spending. So that virtuous cycle is still in place. And the Federal Reserve's model for the first quarter of the year is picking that up, expected growth of 2.9%. And of course, growth is faster in certain parts of the country than others. So this is for the 25 largest or most populous metropolitan areas in America. This is employment growth for those 25 metropolitan areas between February of 2020, again, months before we shut down the economy, and December of 2024. There's a neat correspondence between population growth and job growth. And in recent years, no region of the country has added more people than the Dallas metropolitan area. In fact, among the 25 largest metropolitan areas, no region of the country has added more people in percentage terms than the Dallas metropolitan area. But also, no region of the country overpays their quarterback as much as the Dallas metropolitan area. But I'm persuaded that some of these things are purely coincidental. But again, you'll notice that it's the American South. That's where the population growth has been. That's where the job growth has been. Dallas, Phoenix, San Antonio, Tampa, Charlotte, Orlando, Houston. My theory is that Houston stands to be a really strong market going forward. It's going to take some time, but Houston is America's energy technology capital. And with energy policy making changing so quickly and technologies being not just developed, but deployed so intensely over the course of time, that Houston market really stands to be a boom market going forward. Houston actually was one of the weakest markets in the country during the pandemic itself. You might remember early during the pandemic, oil prices actually went negative, very briefly, but they did. So Houston really stagnated economically during the pandemic relative to other southern markets, but that market is coming back with a vengeance. The only northeastern corridor metropolitan area in the left-hand column, the faster growing markets, is the Philadelphia metropolitan area. You might ask why. Well, everything's going great in Philadelphia, as it turns out. It's always sunny in Philadelphia these days. But it's because many Americans have been searching for affordability. So they've been moving from more expensive metropolitan areas, often to less expensive metropolitan areas. Now, Philadelphia is expensive, don't get me wrong, but not compared to New York. So we've seen a fair amount of migration on I-95 from the New York metropolitan area to Philadelphia, and part of that migration included, as it turns out, Saquon Barkley. But for the most part, the Northeast corridor is in the right-hand column. Slower population growth translates into slower job growth. The New York Metro, Washington Metro, my region of Baltimore, and then Boston Metro. And then you'll see the monsters of the Midwest as well. Chicagoland, for instance, Detroit Metro, Minneapolis Metro, less population growth, less job growth. And then the only region of the country that has failed to recover the jobs lost during the pandemic is the San Francisco metropolitan area. Now, this is employment growth overall. If you just fixate on construction employment growth, you get a very different ranking. In fact, number one in terms of percentage job growth since February of 2020 is the Detroit metropolitan area. Number 5 is St. Louis. How is that possible? Because supply chain's gone back home. Industrial markets are getting a leg up. And so you would expect to see a fairly tight correspondence between overall job growth and employment job growth. But you don't actually see, I should say, construction job growth and overall employment growth, but you don't actually see that here. And that's, again, and I'll talk more about construction activity related to manufacturing later on during the presentation. Again, there is some correspondence at number 25, once again, at the bottom of the second column, is the San Francisco metropolitan area. And then finally, same 25 major metropolitan areas, but instead of construction employment or employment growth overall, these are rates of unemployment. And now you see a bit of a new story emerging in America. You hear all the time when you listen to economists on Bloomberg, CNBC, Fox Business, whatever you happen to watch, oh, the economy is slowing, economy is slowing. You've been hearing a lot of that over the last year. But very little evidence of that in the macroeconomic data, not gross domestic product, 2.8% growth. We accelerated last year vis-a-vis 2023. Now, if you look at the bottom of the second column, you'll notice that some of these unemployment rates are no longer that low. Detroit Metro, 4.0%, Riverside, 4.9%, Los Angeles, 5.2%. These are not high rates of unemployment. I don't mean to make a mountain out of a molehill, but these rates of unemployment are higher than they were. So there's some evidence, it's kind of weak, that this virtuous cycle is starting to falter a bit under the pressure of these higher interest rates. And we'll talk again about that more as we go through the presentation. Now that said, I've said a couple of things here, and one of them was construction job openings are down. Another thing is that unemployment has risen in certain parts of the country. You say, Anirban, does that mean that maybe construction wages won't grow as quickly as they have been? I'm not sure that we can reach that conclusion. And that's because construction competes with other industries for human capital. So this is the US construction wage premium. So historically, construction workers have made meaningfully more than their private sector counterparts. Now this is for non-supervisory workers, meaning non-managerial. These data pertain to production workers. Actually, people on a job site delivering construction services. So historically, construction workers have made more because they're specially trained, often have to work unusual hours, waking up very early in the morning, for instance, and often are exposed to the great outdoors. And so that black line there that runs east and west across the slide represents the construction wage premium, how much more construction workers have made historically during the 20 years prior to the pandemic relative to their private sector counterparts. So the number is 21.7%. So during the 20 years prior to the pandemic, on average, construction workers made 21.7% more than their private sector counterparts. The green line superimposed on that is the construction wage premium at any given moment in time. Just got the January figure, the number is down to 18.5%. So Anirban, how is that possible? That's impossible. Construction workers have never made more than they make right now. That's true. But in certain other occupation categories, compensation growth has been even stronger. I mean, that takes me back to that UPS truck driver, for instance. I do not begrudge the UPS driver that level of compensation. Not at all. These are very special people. Have to be able to drive a large vehicle, have to be able to park it, have to lift heavy objects all day long, as much as 70 pounds, and pass a drug test. Most Americans cannot do all of those things, but construction workers can. Because construction workers can drive a large vehicle, they can park it, they can lift heavy objects all day long, and they can pass a drug test as a general proposition. And so as construction competes with other industries for scarce human capital, and now if you expect to see more activity on the energy patch, more natural gas related activity, more oil production, then that creates another set of competitors for that skilled construction worker. And then, of course, contractors have to compete amongst themselves for that scarce human capital. So I would think that construction wage growth will continue to be quite profound, even though construction job openings have slipped quite mightily over the past year. Okay, enough of that. Let's talk about some of the risks facing the economy right now. Now, we've talked about some of them. Inflation, high interest rates higher for longer. But let's talk about some others. So this is a play on a film called Devil in a Blue Dress, in which Denzel Washington played the part of a very handsome Easy Rollins. I mean, he is very handsome. I think the New York Times called him the best actor of the 21st century so far, in part because he is so handsome. I'm married with 2 children, by the way, but I can still tell, you know. So, but anyway, so what are some of the risks here? Well, okay, you cannot have an economic downturn unless the consumer participates. The consumer is rarely, if ever, the instigator of an economic downturn. That can be a commercial real estate collapse, an attendant savings and loans crisis of the 1980s, or that can be a dot-com bubble bursting, or a housing bubble bursting, or COVID, something like that. But at some point, the consumer's got to become involved in the dynamic for there to be an economy-wide downturn. And thus far, as I pointed out, the consumer has not been involved in any kind of dynamic. But there are some risks out there. For instance, this is a measure called personal savings. This analysis is conducted by economists from the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. So if you look at the green line toward the bottom of the slide, that's personal savings measured in hundreds of billions of dollars. And you can see a reasonably smooth trajectory in personal savings, household savings, as we move toward the pandemic. But then the pandemic changes everything. Because during the pandemic, many Americans received stimulus payments. Not everyone, but almost everyone. Many Americans experienced meaningful compensation increases during the pandemic. And of course, we thank them for working through the pandemic, whether at pharmacies, outpatient medical centers, construction job sites, etc. But that meant that for many Americans, household income was rising precisely when their expenditures were dwindling, because they weren't taking vacations, they weren't seeing movies or plays, they weren't seeing Beyonce or Taylor Swift in concert, or even Ice Spice or SZA. And so according to the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco economists, at the pinnacle, Americans amassed about $2.1 trillion in excess savings, meaning savings above and beyond what they would have saved but for the pandemic. According to those same economists, all of those savings have now been spent, and then some, a drawdown of $2.4 trillion. Now, as that money was being spent, of course, as those savings were being drawn down, it juiced the economy. And look at the end of 2023, those phenomenal quarterly growth figures, 4.9% growth during the third quarter of 2023, for instance, 2.8% growth for all of 2024. But now what are you left with? Increasingly, a consumer who has spent down their pandemic-era savings and continues to face high and rising prices, measured, for instance, by the Consumer Price Index. Now, so this is a situation the consumer faces. Spent on my pandemic-era savings, prices keep rising, but I want to maintain my standard of living, because once one maintains a certain standard of living, one does not want to depart from that. Once one takes a certain caliber of vacation, stays in a certain quality of apartment, goes to a certain type of restaurant, one does not want to give away that elevated standard of living, even if it ostensibly was driven by temporary factors like stimulus payments. But now if the savings are gone and the prices keep rising, how do we make the math work? Well, of course, you turn to the credit card. New York Federal Reserve Bank data regarding credit card debt is spiking. And yes, credit card delinquency is up. Auto loan delinquency is up. Sorry. I just gave a presentation to a group of apartment managers in Maryland, longtime client, and they said to me, we're starting to see more people miss their rental payment. Well, no surprise. More Americans are under financial stress. So that part of the economy is threatened. Now, I'm not talking about the luxury market, by the way. The rich have gotten richer. I think Bezos will be fine. I think Musk will be fine. I really do. I think Sam Altman's going to be just fine. But again, it's that bottom 50% that lives paycheck to paycheck. They're already struggling with the labor market in very good shape, unemployment down to 4%. What happens if the labor market starts to fall apart? And we'll speculate upon that during the forecast part of the presentation. Now, other risks, of course, we still have that specter of remote work and a languishing commercial real estate sector, or aspects thereof. So this is These are the highest office vacancy rates in the country. These are for cities, entire cities, not just downtown vacancy rates. These are for cities. You might see a pattern developing here. San Francisco's at the top here at 36.5%, but a lot of vacant office space. I know that there's a lot of chatter about people coming back to the office. In certain industries like financial services, people come back to the office, I get that. But in other segments of the economy, not as much. And in IT, it's sort of a badge of honor, the fact that they work remotely. Now, we care, of course, about the building owners, loss of rental revenue, those kinds of things, loss of building value. But we care even more, arguably, macroeconomically, about the bankers and their exposure to this. Because capitalism needs capital to operate, and that capital can dry up. So let me give you an example of what's happening. The Wall Street Journal, about 5 months ago, authored an article featuring downtown St. Louis. Now, St. Louis is a beautiful historic American city. And the tallest building in downtown St. Louis is the 44-story AT&T building. In 2006, that building sold for $205 million. It just sold for $3.5 million. Somebody takes that loss. Now, it could be a series of equity holders who chase that valuation down from purchase to purchase, but that also could be some bank's collateral. In my own city of Baltimore, 1 South Street, a prominent feature of our skyline, used to be the Alex Brown building, now the Stiefel building, sold for, in 2015, which was a tough year for Baltimore, $66 million. It sold during a recent summer, for $24 million. Somebody took a loss on that. A bank took a loss on that. Now, one of the other things I do is I'm the chief economist for the Maryland Bankers Association. So I talk to a lot of bankers, and they tell me, Anirban, we don't call it extend and pretend. We never did, by the way. You all called it that. But we do admit that we extend and amend. In other words, if these building owners are having a tough time meeting their debt service, we'll work with them. We don't want the building. We'll work with them. We'll extend the term, so on and so forth. And the notion has been that we'll be a position to refinance them into lower interest rates at some point as interest rates come down. What's the issue? Interest rates are not coming down. And these buildings are losing value as collateral. So as a banker, the longer I wait to foreclose, the bigger my loss potentially. And so I would think that over the next 1 or 2 years, you're going to see more of that foreclosure activity. In fact, you've seen a buildup in U.S. commercial real estate foreclosures recently. And I think you'll see more of that going forward. That's a source of exposure for the U.S. economy. That's all I'm suggesting. I'm not saying that means recession is coming. I'm not saying this is the new subprime mortgage crisis. I am saying there's a risk there, including to certain banks, community banks, regional banks that specialize in commercial real estate lending. So there's just some risks in the economy. And let me use that as a segue to talk about the sector of the economy you have most interest in, which is, of course, real estate and construction. And I use this movie as the segue. It's a 2016 Denzel Washington film in which he plays the part of a Pittsburgh sanitation worker. Okay, let me talk about 2 more interest rates of interest here. 30 fixed mortgage rate here in blue, 15 fixed mortgage rate in green. These data come from Freddie Mac. They're weekly data. And according to Freddie Mac, over the last week for retrieved data, the average 30 fixed mortgage rate sitting at 6.89%. So Anirban, assuredly, you're not going to make a big deal out of a 6.89% 30 fixed mortgage, are you? Because I can remember mortgage rates were 18%. I can remember when they're 15%. That's just not a big deal. Fair enough. But to millennials and Generation Z, these rates are preposterously high. And that's who's really dropped out of the single-family home purchasing marketplace. It's been that would-be first-time buyer, frustrated by lack of inventory, high prices, and by their standards, extremely high borrowing costs. Now, as I move toward the tail end of this presentation, I want to share with you some leading economic indicators because I want to pivot from a discussion of what's been happening to a discussion of what's likely to happen going forward. Here's a leading indicator. This is the U.S. mortgage loan applications composite index. Why is that a leading indicator? Why are mortgage applications a leading indicator? Because often the journey to the settlement table begins with a mortgage application. That's the first indication that we have that somebody now seeks to transact. But mortgage applications are about 78% from the 2021 peak. So what does that tell us? That tells us there are very few people ready to transact. Very few people ready to get to the settlement table from a buyer's perspective. So Anirban, if the buying public has been so dramatically truncated, housing market must be in horrific shape. But as you know, by many measures, it is not. Take U.S. home sales prices as measured by the S&P Case-Shiller Home Price Index. You see this increase in U.S. home sales prices during the pandemic and early stage of recovery therefrom right there. That's a 35% increase in U.S. home sales prices over a very short period of time. But of course, during the pandemic, our behavior changed. Spending more time at home, so we wanted more house, wanted more square footage, wanted more room for home offices and home gyms, wanted one room just for the Peloton. And anytime you see a Peloton advertisement, the only piece of furniture in that room is the Peloton. That's how we Americans choose to live. You buy a Peloton, you put it in a room, you lock the door. And then, of course, when people visit, you open the door, you splash some water on it. Many of us have done it. But the point is, pandemic ended and mortgage rates took off. So what was I thinking naively? I was thinking we were going to give back a meaningful chunk of these home sales price gains. And you can see it actually happened for a few months, but not very long and not very deep. What did I fail to appreciate? What did I get wrong as an economist? I understood there are fewer buyers out there. What I failed to understand is how few sellers there would be. Because if you're locked into a 2.75% 30-year fixed in Kankakee, Illinois, or Duluth, Minnesota, where are you going? You're not going anywhere. So not many buyers, it's true, but also very few sellers. In a country with a structural shortage of home purchasing opportunities, not enough single-family homes, including not for the millennials, you end up with a high equilibrium sales price. Now, this dynamic is changing just a bit. So if you look at the S&P Case-Shiller Home Price Index over a period of time, yeah, home sales prices have increased. If you just look at the last month of data that we have, is for November, the 0 percentage line is right here, right there. 0 percentage line is right there. You'll notice a lot of markets we're starting to see downward pressure on U.S. home sales prices. It's just 1 month of data, so I shouldn't put too much on this. I wish I included this slide in the presentation, actually, now that I look at it. But it is true that some of this is starting to reverse, that at some point, interest rates start to really take the sting out of the U.S. economy, and we're seeing that more and more in terms of constructed job openings, the 1 month change in home sales prices, some evidence that the U.S. economy is under growing stress because there are certain segments thereof under growing stress because of these high and in some cases rising interest rates. This, of course, these dynamics, of course, influence construction activity as well. Another leading indicator, this is U.S. residential building permits. Permits are a leading indicator because if you're a builder, you've got to pull a permit before you build. The orange line there at the top, that's your single-family building permits, and that does not look so bad. So anyone, how is that possible? Especially if you can ignore the 2003, 2004, 2005 housing bubble period. If you can ignore this period, from a long-term perspective, we're pulling more permits now than we did in the years like 2012, 2013, years of economic growth. But why? If the millennials are most populous generation, the also that group will turn 45 this year, by the way. If the millennials are having a tough time transacting, why are single-family builders pulling that many permits? Because there are so few existing homes for sale that single-family builders are still spying opportunities to meet unmet demand, including among millennials. If you'll note, the average size of the newly constructed American home is now shrinking. Less square footage, fewer windows, drives down the price point to a place where more millennials can afford home ownership for the first time. Actual loss of momentum is in that green line, that's multifamily. That relates to future apartments to be constructed. You say, but again, how is that possible? If the millennials are having a generally difficult time transacting, buying a home, getting to the settlement table, they've got to live someplace. The oldest is going to turn 45 this year. They can't live with their parents forever. They can try, but they shouldn't. They have to live someplace. They're going to be leasing apartments. Yes. Well, then why are multifamily builders pulling fewer permits these days? Now, this relates to next generation apartments to be constructed, of course. We built a ton of apartments in this country in recent years. Multifamily market has been a red-hot construction segment until very recently. What's going on here? My thesis, a couple of things, project finance. Increasingly, developers are having a tough time lining up project finance. And sometimes it can get financed, but the interest rate they're being offered by a bank or private credit, whomever it happens to be, is so high, their pro forma no longer pencils out. And even on a pro forma, you can only raise your rent so high. And in certain parts of the country, Austin, Texas, Nashville, Tennessee, rents are falling. In much of the country, apartment buildings, recently constructed often, are selling for a lower price than the previous purchase price, which renders their value as collateral shakier. And so all of a sudden, again, it's that impact of these higher interest rates, in this case on project financing costs, that are really causing that result to transpire. Now, here's another interesting thing. Again, juxtaposing two data series that people typically don't juxtapose, but you see the green line there? The green line is housing units under construction. Now again, we're in a country with a shortage, a structural shortage of housing units. So we should not be seeing this unless there's some kind of outside intervention. Whereas that outside intervention, macroeconomically, again, high borrowing costs, which frustrates the development of some of these units, many of these units. The blue line is employment among residential building contractors. You'll notice number of housing units under construction is down, but the employment among residential building contractors has not changed. So what am I suspecting might happen at some point later this year? You might see a meaningful number of layoffs. A lot of these home builders have had a tough time cobbling together that workforce. And, it's taken them a lot of effort to get these people on board. They are reluctant to let them go, but if they're idle and there are bills to pay, then at some point that happens. So that's another thing to watch for, another reason to think the labor market could weaken later this year. We'll see. Again, these dynamics extend beyond the multifamily segment to include segments of commercial real estate. This is a bit more inclusive leading indicator. This is the Architecture Billings Index. Any reading less than 50 signifies that architects are less busy this month than they were last month. If you look to the right of the slide at the more recent data, you might note that during 16 of the past 17 months, billings are below 50. Architects are getting less busy. The only time they were above 50 was 2 months ago. The reading was 50.3. Again, why is this? Again, my thesis, project finance. And project finance is about more than interest rates, right? The cost of delivering construction services has grown massively in recent years. I mean, you're construction users, you understand this. Construction costs have really gone up. So between the financing costs and the fact that you're having to finance more because construction costs have gone up so dramatically, that translates into fewer green lights on projects. And so people are saying, look, developers are saying, project owners are saying, I can't get this project to market. I don't need the architect to continue to bill me. And the notion, again, is if architects are less busy upstream, contractors tend to be less busy downstream, at least contractors that work on projects involving architects. Now, that said, many contractors are still quite busy. What's keeping them busy? Well, let's talk about that. As defined by the U.S. Census Bureau, there are 16 categories of non-residential construction in our country. All are listed here. And these horizontal bars represent the percentage change in spending for the period February of 2020 through December of 2024. If you look at the blue line, and by the way, these data are not adjusted for inflation. Not adjusted for inflation. So if you look at the blue line at the top, that encapsulates all of non-residential construction. Non-residential construction spending has grown between February of 2020 and December of 2024 by 40.5% now. If you look at the producer price index for the delivery of non-residential construction services, the producer price index reflects how much people who are providing the service are receiving for those services. What has been the inflation rate since February of 2020 for the delivery of non-residential construction services? 39.2%. That means is users of construction services are hardly buying more service than they did years ago. They're simply paying much more for the service they're currently receiving. I'm not saying that's bad or good or anything. I'm not saying it's unfair, anything like that. I'm just simply saying almost all the growth that we see in non-residential construction spending is not because more services are being received or delivered. It's because the cost of delivering those services or receiving those services has gone up. Now, categorically in green, where do we see the growth? Manufacturing. Again, supply chain coming back home. Detroit's at the top in terms of that construction employment growth in percentage terms since February of 2020. These things correspond. November 15th of 2021, President Biden signed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, a $1.2 trillion package, $550 billion of new money, meaning money beyond that which had been previously authorized. So categories like water supply, sewage and waste disposal, which is about 95% publicly financed, and highway and street toward the top. Power is a segment that stands to be very interesting during the years ahead, as the nation seems to have shifted from really aggressively pursuing alternative energies to maybe going back to greater reliance on fossil fuels. We'll see. And then toward the bottom, again, those very interest rate sensitive segments, the office market. Now, the office segment includes the construction of data centers. Well, of course, data center construction, fast, furious, and frenetic, is the traditional office market that continues to be quite weak in terms of fomenting new construction activity. And then lodging, which relates to new hotel room construction, for instance. Leisure travel has come back with a vengeance, but we had built a ton of hotel rooms during the 5 years prior to the pandemic. So it's just now that hotel occupancy rates are rising back to pre-pandemic levels, and business travel actually has not come back that aggressively. And so we just have not seen as much movement in that segment as one might have hoped for. Okay, enough of that. Further juxtaposition of statistics. Okay, what is this? These are measures of inflation. These are producer price indices. There are 2 of them. The green line represents the producer price index for inputs to construction materials. Inputs to construction. And what I'm doing is I'm starting with February of 2020 and growing this series forward from February of 2020 onward. The blue line represents construction bid prices. Again, February of 2020, growing that series forward. You see in 2020 and 2021 how the green line got a head start. Input prices were rising faster than bid prices. That's when many contractors called their attorneys and asked the question, do we have a force majeure clause in this contract? Because we did not build this cost increase into our bids, we're taking a loss. And these CURT members are saying, we don't care. That's what happened. Occasionally. Now, what would economic theory predict? Economic theory would predict that over time these lines will equilibrate. Why? Construction is a very fragmented, competitive industry. No firm has more than 1% market share. And so it approaches something akin to perfect competition. And under perfect competition, economic profits in the long run equals 0. Not accounting profits, that's a separate statistic. Economic profits. And lo and behold, that's exactly what's happened. Since February of 2020, input prices have increased 37.1%, bid prices 37.7%. So, and many contractors tell me they're quite happy with their margins, they are quite upbeat about their outlook, and we'll talk about whether that outlook is justifiably upbeat as we go through the balance of this presentation. We get to the final part of it, the forecast. The glory is yours because this presentation is almost over. But let me talk about some more leading economic indicators. Again, this virtuous cycle in which consumers are spending and businesses are hiring, does that remain in place? We shall see, but this is a leading indicator that reflects small business psychology. This is the National Federation of Independent Businesses Index of Small Business Optimism. Question Small Business America, is it a good time to expand your business over the next 3 months? Now, pre-election, 4% of small business operators said, yeah, it's a good time to expand my business. Post-election, straight line up, 20%. The small business community tends to tilt right. And they're quite happy with the notion of deregulation, maybe tax cuts, so on and so forth. Maybe some of this tariff policy making. To the extent that, for instance, there are producers of various goods that face competition from foreign suppliers, that kind of thing. And actually, since the election, we've seen a bit of a pickup in what's called the hires rate. So this number of hires in any given month divided by the number of people receiving a paycheck. Hires rate had been slumping, again, threatening that virtuous cycle. It picked up in December to 3.4%. I shouldn't make a big deal. It went from 3.3% to 3.4%. You say, that don't make such a big deal. You're right, it probably shouldn't be. But we didn't see a deterioration, at least in December, as we had seen deterioration in prior months. So again, it appears that the U.S. economy has a layer of, or a level of stability that, at least for now, seems to be able to withstand some of the drama coming out of Washington, D.C. on a daily basis. The Conference Board's Index of Leading Economic Indicators, this is actually 10 leading indicators all bundled into one composite index being graphed for you here. It's an index that predicted the 2001 recession, predicted 07, 08, 09, and is now telling us not that recession is coming, but this economy is set to soften. And that's my belief. And that I'm not alone in believing the U.S. economy is going to slow down. You might say, well, what about Donald Trump's pro-growth agenda, Anirban? Yes, I understand. We'll see what happens with tax cuts, so on and so forth. By the way, do we still have a Congress? I'm not even sure we still have a Congress. Do they exist? I don't even know if they meet or whatever happens with them. But I remember them once. So we'll see what happens with tax cuts and these kinds of things. But that can't be implemented immediately. Right now, I take my cues from the stock market. The stock market seems to be suggesting we're okay right now. We're okay. It's volatility here and there, but for the most part, things are okay. So the forecast from various other economists is the same, somewhat of a softer economic environment in 2025. So 2024 here, green colored bars. These are forecasts from the International Monetary Fund, the left-hand couplet. Central couplet is the World Bank. Right-hand couplet is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Again, we grew 2.8%, we know, in 2024. The blue-colored bars are the forecasts. In each of these cases, forecast is for somewhat softer economic growth in 2025. So we're out of time, I think. Maybe, hopefully, I'll have some time for Q&A. But Out of Time was a 2003 film, by the way, starring Denzel Washington and also Eva Mendes, but I never met her. So inflation is poised to make a comeback. Interest rates will be higher for longer. There was, you might remember in mid-September, when it was thought that Kamala Harris might have a chance to win the election, a conventional wisdom that the Federal Reserve would cut rates 6 times in 2025. Now the bond market is saying maybe once, bless you, and I think it could easily be 0 times. And in fact, there's some probability now coming out of the bond market, the next move by the Federal Reserve would be to raise rates. But we shall see. But it wouldn't be that surprising, would it? I mean, if you get tariffs on Chinese goods, no one's even talking about it. 10% additional tariff on Chinese goods, that's sort of a big deal. But there's so much going on, we hardly even had a chance to talk about it. And then 25% tariff on steel and aluminum, and so on, and it goes. And we'll see what happens next month with the Canadians and the Mexicans. We actually buy more now from the Mexicans than the Mexicans than the Chinese. We buy now more from the Mexicans than the Chinese, and that's been the case for the last 2 years. So it is conceivable that interest rates not only don't fall, they could rise. Many consumers now exhausted financially, and circumstances could worsen. Our asset prices overextended. The price-earnings ratio on the S&P is at around 21 this morning. What goes up can come down. That's a fairly historic high. So the market's still quite confident in economic outcomes and corporate profitability, but we'll see if that's justified. So forecast is for growth in 2025, but there are some risks, including rising interest rates and falling asset prices. And with that, thanks a lot for the opportunity. I have a newsletter at www.sagecon.com. There's a free service here, so I'm not necessarily dying for dollars. If you're not interested in the newsletter, please, anytime, feel free to go ahead and pound sand. With that, thanks a lot. Thank you very much. I don't know if I've got time.
For our appreciation, and we have some significant time for some questions. We do have these microphones that are here placed on the aisles. If you have a question, raise your hand. Somebody will note you and then flag me. And we'll take questions both from the app and also from the floor. Let's start with Gracie.
As always, great presentation. The promise of getting out of this is rising productivity, right? It's one of the ways out. And with Trump's stated desire to radically reduce regulation, particularly in our industrial sector, which means projects get financed and they get to market sooner, how does that impact in terms of some of the assumptions? If that is true, how does that impact on some of the assumptions you put up there at the end?
Yeah, that's a great question, which is, I did not talk about the other part, or another part of the Trump agenda, which is deregulation, and not just of the energy sector, but just the broader economy. And wouldn't that yield some efficiencies? Wouldn't that accelerate economic growth? And couldn't it help us grow our way out of our deficits, our national debt, accelerate the economy? The new Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, hedge fund manager, has established a goal of the 3 threes. And the 3 threes are shrink the federal budget deficit to 3% of gross domestic product. It's right now around 7%. Increase oil production by 3 million barrels of a day, which would take us around to 16 0.3 million barrels of oil per day, and then sustained 3% real growth in terms of gross domestic product. And at the heart of that has to be productivity growth. So the notion is that we would unleash an American productivity monster, and it's possible that could happen. I think that's exactly what happened under Reagan. Right? The U.S. economy was suppressed by very, very high tax rates and a lot of regulation. Deregulation, lower tax rates, the American economy blossoms. And of course, does very well under Clinton. I'm not making a partisan statement there, but that's happened. Could we repeat some of that dynamic under a second Donald Trump administration? I think that's possible, yes. I don't think you're going to get, by the way, 3 million barrels of oil per day more. And why is that? Because I don't think oil companies want to produce that much oil. And why is that? Because I think they want to charge more for their oil. They want to maintain a higher price. That's my feeling, but I won't say any more than that because I know we've got folks from ExxonMobil and stuff here, and I don't want to offend them in any way because they're bigger than I am. So, but hopefully that addresses your question. Yes, it is conceivable that there's another part of this that I did not address. Yeah.
There's a question here from the app I want to share with you. Where is the money coming from for the continued rise in retail sales? Is it from the federal government giveaways? Is it credit card debt? Where is it coming from, in your opinion?
Yeah, so great question. The credit card spending is certainly up. And by the way, there's a phenomenon called buy now, pay later, BNPL, buy now, pay later, which is driven by companies like Affirm, which does not report to credit rating agencies, for instance. And so there's a lot of financing going out there. We are, however, seeing real wage growth out there. I mentioned that. So some of this is like genuine. I'm making more now, and I have more money left over at the end of the month. And so there are those kinds of households. So that's another thing. There's a wealth effect working through the U.S. economy, isn't there? I mean, if you own Bitcoin, if you're a 27-year-old American male with Bitcoin, you feel pretty wealthy. You know, if you own NVIDIA stock, you know, an incredible percentage of NVIDIA employees is worth more than $25 million. Incredible percentage. You feel pretty wealthy. So America's become wealthier, so that wealth gets spent in the economy. So a lot of different things happening. And, you know, is it federal giveaways? I think so. You know, the federal government forgives student debt, so I thought I had this obligation. I don't anymore. I'm not saying that's good or bad, but all of a sudden I'm richer and I don't have this payment to make anymore. I'm, you know, buy an Omega, you know, a watch or whatever it happens to be. So lots of things going on out there.
Question, what is your response to stopping the unnecessary federal government spending, which the president and his administration have committed to do, and decreasing the national debt? Any comment on the Elon Musk initiative?
Yes, right, Doge. I think everyone here appreciates the need for the federal government to cut back on its deficits and debt, I think. Last I checked the debt clock, which was last week, America's national debt was $36.4 trillion. As I mentioned, in the first 4 months of the federal fiscal year starts October 1st. So first 4 months would take you through the end of January. $838 billion deficit. It's not sustainable. As I said, you know, 15% greater than it was the same time 1 year ago, 15%. And I get it, part of that's because we came out of the election cycle and politicians tend to spend more money during election cycles because they want to get reelected. But nonetheless, it's not sustainable. So I think many of us appreciate that we need to find, you know, who's against finding waste in government or duplication, so on and so forth? I can't think anybody is. The controversy relates to the means by which this is transpiring. That we have a congressionally sanctioned body like the U.S. Agency for International Development, money has been appropriated to be spent by that agency, and someone not elected by the American people is saying, I'm going to shut down the agency. That's where the controversy is. But I don't think anyone's against the fact that we're taking a look at what is the agency spending on, how is that agency focus changed over time. When AID got first started, a lot of the focus was on, like with the World Bank, infrastructure spending. Over time, the mission emerged or evolved to include social missions. So things like, I'm a father of 2 daughters, so things like female empowerment. You know, I'm all for that. That's a form of economic development. But one could, you know, it's reasonable to investigate that kind of evolution and ask the question, is that the way the money should be spent? So I guess the question is, if there was just a bit more process and definition around the way these agencies are being impacted, whether it's NIH or other agencies, I think more Americans could feel they're on board with this. But because it seems so haphazard and there's a lack of accountability, this is the issue. But we have to do something. Yeah. Oh well, okay.
It's okay to agree with Hanuman or disagree.
Yeah, 3 out of 100.
This is the fun part.
Yeah.
How is the strength of the U.S. dollar affecting our growth?
Oh yes, this is interesting, because I think there's a inconsistency in some of the policy making. So one of the things the Trump administration is very angry about is America's massive trade deficits. Okay. Now, why do we have a trade deficit with many nations? Is it because they deal with us unfairly? Yes, in part that's the case. That's why these reciprocal tariffs are so interesting, right? So what the Trump administration has said is we want to put reciprocal tariffs. So if the Indians have a 20% tariff on paper coming from America, we'll put a 20% tariff on paper coming from India, that kind of thing. So the Indians have some significant tariffs on American goods. Reciprocal tariffs would really be quite bad for the Indian economy. So is that America insisting on fair trade? I think it is. That's okay, I think. Here's the thing, though. We will run a trade deficit with the Indians and many other nations. Why? We have more money. We have more money to buy their things than they have to buy our things. And the same is true with the Vietnamese, the Malaysians, and the Bolivians, et cetera. So one of the reasons we have trade deficits is because we're the richest country in the world. The second reason is the dollar is so strong, it renders our exports less competitive and imports more appealing to our consumers. So today, a euro can only buy $1.03 US. It's very weak. I mean, we're almost at parity with the euro. 1 British pound today can buy something like $1.23 or $1.24. The pound is quite weak by historic standards. Talk to a Canadian, They'll tell you 1 Canadian dollar can only buy around 69 cents. It's nothing. There was a time a few years ago when 1 Canadian dollar could buy 105 US cents. Now it's down to 69 cents. So of course you're going to tend to run deficits with nations when your currency is so strong. So on the one hand, the Trump administration said, as did the Reagan administration, by the way, we want a strong dollar policy. We want a strong US dollar. But we also want smaller trade deficits. Macroeconomically, it doesn't work that way. Now, if we can get better treatment for our exports, more power to us. Again, America would disagree with that approach. But if you really want to address some of these trade deficits, you probably need a dollar that's more reasonably valued. It's so valuable right now, and there's some benefit to that, but shrinking the trade deficit is not one of them.
I think we have a question from the floor. Gracie? And one back here.
So in one of your slides, you noted that in the last 4 years, power is increasing by about 20%. And I'm just curious, based upon the work that you're following, do you have any indication about, the projects in wind, solar, even nuclear? What is the appetite for it right now in your tea leaves? Do you have any indication right now for those?
Yes, right. So there's, with respect to energy, others are much more expert in this than I am, but I have the privilege of speaking to the Department of Energy at least once a year. So I talk to some of their folks about policymaking, but a lot of the policymaking comes not just from the federal government, but from state capitals, right? So governors in Maryland and California and New York State and elsewhere have these significant mandates, right? Pushing hard for cleaner, renewable energy, so on and so forth. It's not just a Washington, D.C. phenomenon. So while Washington, D.C. is pushing one direction right now, let's talk about clean coal. Let's talk about natural gas and more pipelines and so on and so forth, and bulking up production of crude petroleum, those kinds of things. Governors in other states are often talking about something very different. So and also America needs more energy just generally, right? With data centers, we're going to use at some point something like 12% of all the electricity in America, in just a few years. So we need to produce much more energy. So there's a place at the table for all of these sources of energy, hydroelectric, whatever it happens to be. And so I think you're seeing a lot of investment across the board in a lot of these different things. Now, the Trump administration can push back on offshore wind in certain segments. That's true and is. But by and large, I think you're going to see a significant increase in investment in both renewable energy and traditional, meaning fossil fuel derived energy, and that's why I say Houston is America's energy technology capital. So much of this regional development activity and diffusion of technologies is taking place coming out of the Houston metropolitan area. That market, in my mind, is going to just explode economically. It's already massive, of course, but it's going to get even bigger. It's going to be really, and they have amazing Indian food, as it turns out. So I expect to spend a lot of time in Houston going forward, yeah.
Let's take one from Andy over here.
Anirban, I want to get your thoughts on another controversy. Last week, the professional football writers voted to elect Josh Allen as MVP over Lamar Jackson, despite Lamar Jackson's far superior statistics and setting historical records for their offense this year. Could you share your thoughts on that controversy?
Rigged. It was rigged. I mean, it's rigged. What can you say? We're going to march on M&T Bank Stadium. It's rigged. The whole thing is rigged. Lamar Jackson's the greatest quarterback in the NFL, and he's going to win Super Bowl 60. You watch.
Let's take one from the app. How feasible is it for commercial real estate stakeholders to convert to residential real estate?
Yes.
Talk about that.
Great question. So yeah, I mean that seems to be the panacea, right? We don't have an issue here, do we? Because okay, we got in certain markets, not everywhere, by the way. I mean, economists talk about this or paint this with too broad of a brush. So the office market's in tough shape. Office market's in tough shape in certain parts of the country. You know, I delivered a presentation recently in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, because that's how glamorous my life is. And I was speaking to a group of commercial real estate developers who said to me, Anirban, we need more office space in central Pennsylvania because we've got major medical centers like UPMC and Geisinger and others expanding. They need some space. Okay, understood. But again, in older central business districts often, in the older buildings they're in, that's where the trouble is. You know, downtown San Francisco with a nearly 40% vacancy rate, that kind of thing. And so you say, okay, well, we don't have enough housing in America. We have too much office space in at least parts of America. Problem solved, we just convert. But then I talk to architects and they tell me actually a precious few or a precious small proportion of buildings, office buildings, for instance, can be converted for residential purposes. There's ceiling heights, issues of where the elevators are placed, all kinds of different things, parking, egress, ingress. And by the way, it's incredibly expensive to convert, even under the best of circumstances. So what do you need to support that kind of conversion? Extremely high rents. But all this new development we've seen has been associated with premium product, luxury product, high rents, because that's the only kind of product that can get the pro forma to pencil. So there's already saturation in that segment. It's very expensive to convert these buildings. Not all of them can be converted. In fact, we convert more hotels into apartment buildings than we do office buildings. Because hotels, of course, are already structured for residential living, so it's simpler. So it's not a panacea. A lot of these older, depreciating Class B and Class C buildings will remain depreciating Class B and Class C buildings. And one of the things I've said is among the busiest contractors going forward are demolition contractors. At some point, these buildings lose so much value they can't be converted. It just makes sense to demolish them. The greater value is in the developable land underneath.
Interesting. Along those lines, what are your thoughts on the baby boomers aging out of that market and the influx of perhaps new housing to that market?
Yes, so...
Baby boomers have an impact on this.
Yes, of course. I think you will. That was a joke. You can figure it out. Okay, it doesn't matter. Yes, so... the definition of the baby boomer generation, it varies depending on whom you ask, but let's say it's from 45 to 64, birth year, 1945 to 1964. So the oldest of that group, this turns 80 this year, right? So that group increasingly is, looking to downsize, of course, has been downsizing, but also probably increasingly looking towards assisted living, so on and so forth, senior housing generally. So senior housing stands to be a real winner going forward. Many boomers, including the older boomers, have worked so hard to stay in their house as long as possible, right? And they've upgraded their homes, they've done the stair lifts and all these kinds of things, the walk-in bathtubs, all these things. But now at some point when some type of care is required occasionally with respect to the activities of daily living, then they move. A couple of things happens. One, that creates more demand for senior living units, and I think there is more demand for those units, and certainly in certain parts of the country, particularly the American South, I would say, but also states like Delaware. And then second, it creates opportunities for millennials to backfill the homes that they are leaving. So one of the things that you will see at some point is the realtor is going to have a field day because mortgage rates are going to come down. More and more seniors are going to say, let's downsize, and more millennials are going to say, oh, mortgage rates are low enough, I can transact now, and they're going to enter the market, and there's going to be a ton of time spent at the settlement table. So it'll be from famine to feast for many realtors. So that's what I would predict for the housing market over the next 5 to 10 years.
Fascinating. Can and should the president meet with the Federal Reserve Board to discuss fiscal and monetary policies? Talk about their interactions, especially with this president.
Yes. So, the president has said that the Federal Reserve should cut rates. And Jerome Powell has been very clear, our Federal Reserve chairman, that the president doesn't get to make those kind of decisions. The Federal Reserve chairman was asked during a recent meeting, would he step down? Because the president has said he should step down. He said, not in your life, no way. And one of the ways for the Federal Reserve to affirm its independence from the president, from the executive branch generally, is to raise rates. And I've had this thesis working in my mind that Jerome Powell is going to be tempted at some point to say, you know what, this president keeps putting pressure on me, wants me to reduce rates. I keep insisting the Federal Reserve is independent, an independent central bank. I'm going to raise rates on him. We'll see, but it is conceivable that one of the things, it would be almost subconscious, not a conscious decision on his part or the Federal Open Market Committee's part, but it is conceivable for them to want to reaffirm their independence as a policymaking body and therefore that to transpire. And I think the inflation data are going to give them some cover to do that.
Given the huge disparity and the wealth gap that you presented in your first few slides, what, in your opinion, would be an equitable, democratic way to narrow or level the playing field, to put more wealth in the bottom 50%? Any thoughts?
Oh, gosh, that's so challenging because we are such an entrepreneur-centric environment, and so the mantra is we let entrepreneurs make as much money as they can. And so, by the way, Elon Musk's wealth just fell below $400 billion. Yeah. So it's not as if every day is good for him, So, but we allow that, right? That's that's one of the reasons, by the way, we pay CEOs so much, right? CEOs get a ton of money in part because that's the carrot everyone's looking at, right? Everyone's looking for that C-suite. They want to be up there. They'll stay with the company. They'll work their way up through middle management. They're going to stay there because they see that big payday. So it's a retention tool. But then, of course, once the CEO becomes the CEO, they get that payday, right? What can we do? The solution has always been, or the answer, I should say, the response has always been education. Oh, it's always been that. We said that's one of the reasons that we're the first country in the history of the world to provide universal free public education. But that does not seem to be working that well anymore, right? Because, I think you've got to broaden it to say, I guess, education and training. Because, there's all kinds of opportunities in the construction trades, the manufacturing trades, so on and so forth. That's another response. I gotta say, maybe also play with the tax code in a way that's a bit fair. It doesn't allow for so much accretion of wealth, but I really don't have a good answer to this because I don't want to stunt capitalism and entrepreneurship. At the same time, the nation is so broken up over this wealth disparity, right? There's so much resentment out there. And there's so much power concentrated in the hands of these billionaires, right? They've become politically powerful, not just economically powerful, and it just doesn't feel right to me. It just feels like this story could end very, very badly for us if we allow it to transpire this way.
Interesting. Gracie.
So that leads into my question about, in light of how so few hold the economy through the great wealth, is the market even related to the economy anymore? Because most of the people that are in the market are in that top 10%. And whether some of these things that are going on don't really impact how they invest or whether they invest or not.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think the market and the economy actually, they're not the same thing, obviously, but there is a strong correspondence. These companies derive their strength from the American consumer, from business investment decisions they make, the American economy generally, the global economy. And one of the other things about it is that, as it turns out, thanks to Robinhood and some other platforms, more and more Americans own stock than has ever been the case. And one of the things that we could do, to address the previous question, is a lot of the reasons that many people don't have money is because they're not that responsible with money. I don't want to blame the victim, so much, but a lot of people are pretty irresponsible with money. One of the things I do a lot of is I speak at a lot of casinos. That's because a lot of meetings are held at casinos. And I see who's playing and when. My presentation might be at 7:30 a.m. People are on the floor before me, and maybe they never left that night. And I know they're losing because they keep playing. Because if they won, they would have stopped playing, but they kept losing. So anyway, what can I tell you? The stock market has been such a wonderful opportunity for so many Americans, right, to build wealth. The key is to save and invest. And the key to saving and investing is to make enough income so that you can save some of it to invest. And the key to getting a job that allows you to make enough income so that you can save some of the money to invest it is education and training. Mm-hmm. So I think it all comes back to that we have to have really great education and training programs. We have to emphasize consumer literacy or household financial literacy. I don't know how else to do it. I know that there's another part of us that says, let's just tax the billionaires and redistribute the income, right? Who needs Jeff Bezos, right? I agree. Who does need Jeff Bezos? But that's not the way we operate as a structure, right? He made what he made. He created what he created. It's a Goliath. It's very successful. A lot of consumers use it all the time. It's very convenient. It saves a lot of time, all those kinds of things. And he is a primary beneficiary of what he has created, of course. Do we want to stunt that kind of incentive? That's not the American way. Mm-hmm. That's not what has positioned us to be at the cutting edge of almost every leading industry in the world, every cutting edge industry. So what can I tell you? There's no solution here. I wish we had not gotten to this point of this much wealth inequality in the first place, because it's really hard to dig your way out of it when you get to this point. The question is, the rejoinder is, don't I think AI is going to make that even worse? Yeah, of course, right? Because it's going to create another set of very, very, on the one hand, it's going to make things better, right? To the extent that it empowers us to do our work, it saves us time and so on and so forth, that you all of a sudden have this AI customer agent who's able to solve your problem very, very quickly. That helps us, doesn't it? But on the other hand, you can see what's going to happen, right? A bunch of AI companies are going to come to initial public offering in the next couple of years. We're going to mint a number of billionaires. They're going to become very, very powerful, influential, so on and so forth. Sam Altman is the first, example of that, but there are going to be many, many others. Power will become even more concentrated. People have all our information. It'll be easier to hack us, all these kinds of things. The world is going to end. I don't know. I really don't know what's going to happen, if it's going to get better or worse. But if you invite me back, I'll talk about it next year, I guess. Any other questions here?
Let's take another one from the floor. Andy?
So relative to what's changing at the border and the border policy, what's your view on impact of that can be relative to construction labor availability, quality, and output?
Yeah, right. So, I looked at some of the data to the extent that it's available regarding undocumented workers working in construction. I think the number is over 1 million. They tend to be more concentrated in residential construction than non-residential construction. In states like California, Texas, and Florida, 40% of all construction workers are foreign-born. Throughout the country, in many communities, a majority of painters, drywallers, plasterers, roofers are foreign-born. I don't know if they're documented or undocumented. That's the problem. The data are not very clear on that. But many of them are foreign-born. And during the first Trump administration, though there was a lot of talk, of course, about the border and so on, so building a border wall, and some of those things happened, there wasn't that much enforcement against employers that utilized undocumented workers. Enforcement was actually quite light. And that continued really under the Biden administration. But now under the second Trump administration, there seems to be a level of determination that I had not seen during the first administration. And so, we've seen more ICE agents showing up on job sites and arresting people on job sites, whether in Chicago or elsewhere. And all of a sudden, if I'm an employer and I've been using undocumented workers, I might think twice about that in a way that I did not necessarily before. There's always this plausible deniability, right? Because people bring me, this is the Social Security card they bring me, or they bring me a tax identification number, whatever it happens to be, right? Or they come through a labor broker, and the labor broker assures me that they are documented. So I have plausible deniability as an employer. But now I have to think, as an employer, is that plausible deniability really strong enough to protect me? And to the extent that that would limit the ability of the industry to utilize the services of these foreign-born workers, what can I tell you? That tightens up the labor market. These are very productive people. I'll give you an example. In Baltimore, we're famous for our row homes, among other things, crab cakes, but row homes, and they're constantly being rehabilitated. These are older structures, 19th century, early 20th century, so on and so forth. And lots of stories in neighborhoods about complaints because people are still working at 9 p.m., 10 p.m., 11 p.m., drywalling, whatever it is they're doing, making a ton of noise. You say, why is this happening? Because no one told those workers to go home. Mm-hmm. They're just so hardworking. You have to tell them to go home and they'll stop working. If you take that kind of worker out of the U.S. labor market, out of the construction labor market, which is already quite challenged to find that kind of talent and that kind of effort supply, that drives up costs further, right? More project delays, so on and so forth. So, I understand a law's been broken. People have come across the border. I'm not saying that we are not a sovereign nation, so don't have a strong southern border. But let's face it, it's hard not to root on occasion for people who come here working really hard and they're devoted to their families and to God. It's hard not to root for them to a certain extent, and that's often who we're trying to send back home now. So.
Let's show our appreciation for Anibon for another outstanding presentation.